Hi, well, welcome to my podcast. I'm Matt Craze, and I'm the founder of Spheric Research, which looks at the global seafood industry, and we collect data on this. And I'm delighted to be joined by Manuel Barange, who is of the FAO and the Director of the Fisheries Division. And Manuel, first of all, thanks so much for joining me. Where are you in the world today, by the way? I haven't asked that.
Today I'm in Rome in my office. Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. And I happen to be joining from Santiago, Chile today. And the first thing I really wanted to get into, I'm so curious to ask, somebody who's in charge of such an important division in the FAO. We see statistics and these incredible annual yearbooks every year on what's happening in world aquaculture and wild capture. But sometimes the FAO is it's quite a big, sprawling organization, sometimes quite difficult for people to understand what exactly it's doing. So I wondered if we would just start off by you telling us a little bit about what the FAO does in fisheries and aquaculture.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, FAO is known to many, but the work of FAO is not that known. People get very confused as to what FAO does. I mean, first of all, FAO was created in 1945 at a time where 80% of the world was living in poverty, which is difficult to understand and comprehend today. And when actually the scientific opinion was that the world couldn't feed more than 3 billion people. And that was the beginning of FAO. How do we actually understand the food production systems? What do we produce? In what way? For what reason? What do we consume? What do we trade? To understand whether we could really feed the world as the world increased in population. And of course, now the challenge is to feed a world of 10 billion people. And this is a bit of a context of what FAO in general does. In the case of fisheries and aquaculture, we have, I would say, three main areas of generic work. The one you referred to is the collection, analysis, and dissemination of all data available out there on production, consumption of fish products, trade, employment, anything to do with the industry. That's one area of work, which is very academic. The second area of work is much more political, is negotiating with countries, agreements, protocols, standards that could be transferred through to national legislation to make sure that in the way that we produce food, fisheries, aquaculture products, that we use standards that are more or less accepted by everybody, and that we improve their capacities across the world collectively. And the third area of work, it's on the field, is us working in the field with countries, with institutions, developing their capacity to develop sustainable fisheries, to develop aquaculture practices, to develop the value chains of aquatic foods and the like. And this third part, it is always in partnership. But FAO has the great advantage that we have almost 150 country offices around the world with people with boots on the ground. And that is what allows us to combine the data collection, system and analysis, the political work with work on the ground.
Right. And, going back to, the 1940s when the genesis of the FAO, I mean, I've been speaking to my mum a lot this week, and when she was born in 1950, there were still rations in the United Kingdom, obviously from the UK. And at that stage, aquaculture didn't really exist in many parts of the world. So in essence, aquaculture has been born as a mass industry after the FAO was created. So I guess in a way, you've been there since the very beginning of that industry.
Yes, you can say that. Of course, aquaculture existed already in Roman times and in China even before that. But as an industry, as a food production system, it really took off in the 70s and 80s. So for sure, we have been seeing this from the beginning. And in fact, in the beginning, my division here in FAO was the Division of Fisheries. Aquaculture was almost like a corner activity. But now it is just as important as fisheries, as I'm sure we will discuss in a moment. So yes, we have seen the progress, and we have seen what is it that has made a new industry as successful as aquaculture has been. And that provides lots of lessons as well for all the industries.
Right. And one of the things that the FAO does, every 2 years, it produces the SOFIA report, which gives an outlook for the world, the state of fisheries and aquaculture, and targets to increase production. And I think that what I've understood from this report is that the challenge is firstly to boost aquaculture in line with the growth in the global population that would, I think the target's 20% by 2050. But one of the problems that the chief challenges that you face is so much of the industry is in Asia, the Asia region, 90%, and you've got 2% in Africa. So there are kind of these imbalances that you have to address. And please tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, at first I wouldn't call that a challenge. I call that as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Aquaculture is a very successful industry. It has been growing from the turn of the century. We just look at the recent past, from the turn of the century to 2022, which is when the limit of the data that we have currently globally. For this 22 first years of the century, it has been growing globally at about 5% per year. There is no other food sector that has been growing at remotely that sort of level. So it has been very successful. And yes, it's true that at the large majority, over 80% of that production takes place in Asia. It's not just in China. China is by far the biggest producer, but is not the only one. And in fact, we have been seeing from the beginning of aquaculture a very interesting transition where in the 70s and 80s, no, in the 60s and 70s, the main producers were actually European, was France and Spain. Right. And now the majority of the top producers are actually Asian. Is Vietnam, is Philippines, is India, is China, of course. So we have seen a transition in the dominance because it's been so successful as an industry in Asia. Now, what that tells us is two things. First, that there is a great potential in other areas to replicate what has happened in Asia. Of course, this is, has to be contextual and has to be based on local needs and what have you, but it provides a very clear opportunity, which has been recognized by many countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America, that are looking at the data and saying, well, what is it that we are not doing, considering that Africa, for example, as a continent, is a net importer of aquatic products. So how do we actually compensate for that? So I see it as an opportunity, as a great opportunity for industry, for governments, for international institutions. And it's a challenge that we are very ready to tackle as an opportunity.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the three areas you mentioned of your bodies of work within the FAO. So you have the academic exercise at looking at what's going on in these countries. And secondly, you work with different industry actors. And thirdly, you have these, the boots on the ground, as you put it. Could you give me an example of how you would be working boots on the ground in an African country and what types of progress you're able to achieve in boosting aquaculture?
Sure. And let me just give you, as we're talking so much about aquaculture, an example of the second part of the work that we do, this political area of work of negotiating with countries. We have this great capacity to bring all the countries in the world to FAO headquarters in Rome, also every 2 years, to discuss fisheries and aquaculture issues. The last meeting was actually in July this year, so just a few weeks back. We had 1,000 people in this building in Rome. And in that meeting, we actually all the countries agreed to new guidelines for sustainable aquaculture growth. Mm-hmm. And these guidelines, so the set of principles that we expect countries to take into consideration when they develop aquaculture are now going to be rolled out to all those countries that have an interest in developing the sector. And this is completely connected to the third area of work, this boots in the ground that you mentioned. In Africa, for example, we are currently working with approximately 35, 36 countries in different areas of aquaculture development. So some of these examples, or some of these areas of work include, I'll mention Zambia, for example, where for the last decade we've been working with the government and with funding institutions, particularly the African Development Bank, providing the enabling conditions for the country to develop its sector with the funding of the African Development Bank, with the technical support of FAO, and with the government and the private sector of the country aligned with us. And thanks to that, actually, Zambia has grown its production of aquaculture from the top of my head now, but in about a decade and a half, from about 10,000 tons of tilapia to about 90,000 tons today. So huge development that comes as well with a big commitment from the private sector. Now, when we develop aquaculture, there's a number of things that we do in every country. The first is, what is your legal framework? Do you have a policy to develop aquaculture? Because if you don't have a policy and a legal framework, you need to develop one. No one is going to invest in a sector where you don't know exactly what are the boundary conditions. The second is, well, let's look at the capacity in the ground. What sort of waters do you have? What sort of technical knowledge do you have? The third is, look at the private sector. How do we bring investment into the sector? And then the fourth is, start developing the capacity, running workshops, providing startup opportunities, working with the government with incentives for new entrants, and so on and so forth. This process sometimes takes years, but we know it works. It has worked. I mentioned Zambia, but I could mention quite a few other countries. Now, there are some countries that already have aquaculture quite developed, and our investments with them tend to be much more focused. For example, doing trainings on biosecurity, if they have had a problem with biosecurity, with disease control in the past, or in terms of feeding ingredients, if they have a limit in the feeds that they can bring into the country. So sometimes it's very technical and specific, sometimes it's more generic about developing an industry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's I've noticed a couple of, if staying on the topic of Africa just briefly, there are these remarkable success stories. For example, Egypt growing its tilapia industry. And then we've seen challenges as well with many of the West African countries who, of course, import very large quantities of pelagic fish, have somewhat struggled to increase aquaculture. It's quite interesting how that works. One of our staff went to Ghana earlier this year, and what he found was that they were struggling with imported feed costs. Some of the official producers that were larger producers recognized by the country were struggling with these feed costs. However, there was this kind of proliferation of homestead aquaculture everywhere. And it was really interesting how that worked. And it was, it was quite difficult for us to break down and understand.
Yeah, because it's a complex industry. I mean, first of all, it is a business. So aquaculture has to be financially viable. There's some heavy upfront costs to be recouped later on. And as the industry develops, there are three very clear, immediate stumbling blocks. And the three Fs, fingerlings, fish, feed, and finance. As the industry develops, suddenly you need to feed that fish, and you need to find where to source that feed, and feed is expensive. Of course, it is also one of the areas, feed, where we have seen more technological and scientific development, enormous development, to the point now that, for example, the most expensive feed, fish meal, it is used in very reduced quantities, sometimes only for the juvenile stage and for the final feed, and in between, It's just vegetable meals. So there's a lot of development in that sense. We also do actually a lot of aquaculture development for restoration purposes, and that's something that also needs to be noted. For example, in Gambia, in Senegal, we do a lot of work on developing oyster farming that protects and replants mangroves. So some of these oysters grow on the mangroves, or that's where they grow, attached to the mangroves. And historically, the traditional way of harvesting will be just cutting the mangroves and then harvesting the oysters. We have several projects in those countries where we actually, first of all, put artificial long lines for that oysters grow on the lines rather than on the mangroves. And at the same time, while they collect the oysters from these artificial lines, they replant mangroves at the same time. So it has environmental benefits as well as food security and employment benefits. So there are many of these opportunities that make the sector quite complex. So I'm not surprised that if you go to one particular country, you might actually find it difficult to see the wood for the trees. But it is complex, and that's part of this beauty.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And you mentioned how the FAO works with the private sector. Do you find that the private sector is interested in certain areas of aquaculture over others? And maybe is it difficult to capture and captivate investors to come to certain areas or come to certain species, for example?
Well, working with the private sector is an absolutely essential element of supporting an industry. And because at the end of the day, it is the private sector who develops the industry itself. There are two areas where we work very closely with private sector. The first one is trying to understand developments in the scientific and technical news that very often are not happening in academia, actually are happening in the research and the development inside companies. So trying to get as much information, understanding that some of it is protected and we have to respect that, but understanding the developments so that when we provide advice to countries, we are aware of the latest knowledge and the latest research. So this is one element of generic engagement with the private sector. When it comes to development in the field, on the ground, our engagement with the private sector is very much hand in hand with governments. So we would not be approaching a private sector in a country without government being part of it. We are an intergovernmental organization. We start with the government, but we make it very clear when we engage with the government that sooner rather than later, they have to engage with their own private sector, and that we are ready to provide that support, technical support, that in many places that industry also needs. So it's a complex area of work, trying to make sure that we remain sort of neutral, that we are benefiting the country and not individual companies, but recognizing that without these individual companies, the country cannot benefit.
Right. We notice as a globally focused consultancy that so much of the attention and the interest from investment groups that we hear about are the high value species that are reaching more affluent consumers. So types of premium whitefish that might go into a land-based aquaculture facility, or growing the supply of salmon, which has this structural shortage. How does the FAO look at that? Do you see that there's a kind of oversized interest in the high-value stuff and the opposite with the low-value species, or is it different?
No, and I know what you're saying, but of course, aquaculture it's a very large industry that targets many species. You know, we estimate that approximately we culture about 700 or just over 700 species types in the world. So it's a very broad industry when you look at it. The majority, in terms of volume, the majority of the production is carps, it's tilapias, it's oysters, it's mussels. In fact, salmons and trouts are only the 9th or 10th group in terms of the volume of production globally. So, of course, our emphasis is primarily on aquaculture as a provider of food. So we focus particularly on those species and those systems that provide food for the people. And so a lot of what we do has to do with that, is mussels, is oysters, is tilapia, is carps of different types. That does not mean that we are not interested in salmon aquaculture or aquaculture for the purpose of generating income, trade. That is, of course, very important, and some countries benefit from it. For example, I was in Lesotho just 2 weeks ago, visiting some of the aquaculture farms in the highlands. All the aquaculture in Lesotho, not all, but the large majority of aquaculture in Lesotho is actually trout. And it's entirely for export, almost entirely to South Africa. And the country values that as a generator of income. They don't grow it for food necessarily, although some of it is, of course, consumed internally. So different countries might have different objectives. We are here to support them in their objectives. But those objectives, we normally only work with countries or what we used to call developing countries, countries that require the support of FAO to develop further. The countries that have very technologically rich industry, they don't really need our help. They can do their work by themselves, of course.
Yeah. And we talked about the mass of production being these freshwater species, the carps and the tilapias, and marine aquaculture being a much smaller segment, and that tends to be where these higher value species are. But do you see marine aquaculture becoming a bigger share of all aquaculture in the future?
A bigger share, I am not so sure. A bigger volume, certainly. And the reason why I say not sure whether it will be a bigger share is because aquaculture needs space and needs rights. And aquaculture on land it is much simpler to obtain the rights that you need in order to set up, a number of ponds. If you own the land and there is clear legislation, that's your decision, use your investment, that's what you do. When it comes to mariculture, it's more complex because the coastal zone is subject to different industries and different interests, and it is not owned by anyone in particular, it is the countries. And so there's the development of mariculture sometimes gets caught in fights in the courts as to what is that you do or don't do. The government trying to decide in terms of marine spatial planning what is allowed and what is not allowed. So it can be much more complex depending on the nature of the country and the legislation in that country. So for that reason, I think that aquaculture on land will continue to grow with probably not at the same level as now, because as the volumes increase, the percentage growth has to decrease, but it will continue to grow at a significant pace. Mariculture will grow as well, but perhaps not at the same pace unless countries make a determined decision to promote that as an industry. And that will have to mean that you have to determine what areas you want to use for aquaculture, what areas you limit for tourism or energy generation or whatever other purposes they might actually wish. So that's the challenge, and that's why I'm not sure that it will be percentually growing faster than land aquaculture.
Right. Because I guess if we talk about natural constraints, the areas of fresh water, so rivers and reservoirs and lakes in the world are obviously is a finite resource. Many of these opportunities have already been reached. I remember seeing a few years ago that the actual acreage in Chinese aquaculture started to recede for the first time, or at least would slow down in the growth. So I guess what we're talking about here is better utilization of the areas that are used to grow fish on land and shellfish.
Well, that's a good point. I think that one has to separate what is it that we expect to happen in places where aquaculture is very developed already, and what in places where aquaculture is not very developed. In FAO, we have a strategy in relation to fisheries and aquaculture, which we call blue transformation. And the main objective of this blue transformation is to continue expanding and intensifying aquaculture. But those two terms are very important. In places like China, where aquaculture is very extensive already, what we expect is intensification in terms of increased efficiency and increased improvement in the use of resources. We don't expect an expansion. We expect perhaps a reduction in the feed, perhaps a better use of what is being cultured, better use of the byproducts of the aquaculture itself. While in places like in Africa and Latin America, actually there is a significant room for expansion. You mentioned that freshwater lakes and rivers are limited. Yes, they are limited. That's not what limits aquaculture, because you can have aquaculture in artificial ponds. But even in natural rivers and lakes, there is some significant capacity for growth in African lakes as well. And that we do. We have work in Lake Kariba, we have work in Lake Victoria, and many countries come to us saying, look, we have significant waterways that we want to use better. South Sudan, the Minister of South Sudan was with me here 3 weeks ago requesting that. So there are many opportunities, and we have to make sure that we are clever enough to identify what is best for each country, depending on their circumstances and their needs. Aquaculture at the end is a food system, and all food systems have impacts, and all food systems require trade-offs. And then the importance here is, when we look at a particular country, is that we understand what are the trade-offs, and that we balance those in terms of developing aquaculture. Because at the end of the day, let's face it, aquaculture feeds people, and we cannot cross our arms when we have a situation as we have now, where almost 800 million people in the world are undernourished, where more than 600 are still expected to be undernourished at the end of this decade. And we are not being clever and intelligent in finding new ways of producing food sustainably and effectively and inclusively. And aquaculture certainly is one of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Manuel, I'd like to ask you about yourself. I'm going to ask about fisheries as well, but just, as you speak about that and you show your passion about this topic, how did you get into all of this? How do you become the Director of Fisheries at the FAO?
Well, Director of Fisheries and Assistant Director General of FAO as well. So how did I get to that? Well, I'm a marine biologist by education. I'm an ecologist by training. And actually, I started my career as a fisheries observer in the high seas in the Atlantic Ocean, collecting data, sometimes spending so many weeks at sea that once I remember coming back home and my daughter didn't recognize me, which was quite upsetting at the time. Well, exactly, a big beard. From then, I started working for the South African government. I'm a South African Spanish national in the management of the resources, understanding particularly the connection between fisheries and the marine environment. So where do fish live? What do they do? What are the seasonality of the processes? And developing management strategies as a result. From then, I moved to the UK as an academic. I thought that I needed to do more science, that I needed a stronger scientific background. I'm proud to say that I'm an honorary professor at the University of Exeter in the UK. I directed a research institute in England. And from that, at some point, I decided that I could combine my scientific knowledge, my field work, and my government work to support an institution like FAO, which is the only UN agency that deals with fisheries and aquaculture. And this has been sort of the pinnacle of my career. I haven't been prouder of what I've achieved than working for FAO. So this is how one gets to this place. It's a nightmare of an organization. I have 195 bosses, which are the 195 members of FAO. But it is extremely enriching and enlightening, and you understand the world way better when you have 195 different bosses than when you only have one.
Yeah, 195 as in the number of countries that you work with. Is it to do with the number of countries or really 195 bosses?
Well, there's 195 members of FAO. One of the members is the European Union, so it represents 27 countries. So we call them members, but the majority are countries. But yes, every country, this is an intergovernmental organization. We are member-led. Every country can tell me at some point that they don't like what I do, and I have to think about carefully whether I'm doing the right thing. So that's what I mean by 195 bosses.
Right. And my children are dual nationals, so I'm always interested in that topic. How much time did you spend living in South Africa, and how much have you spent being in Spain?
I lived in Spain about 20 years. I lived in South Africa about 15 years. I lived in the UK about 17 years, and now in Italy about 9 years. Yes, I also lived in Namibia for 2 years before that. So, every UN officer that you speak to, if you ask them where do they come from, they actually look at their feet and start shuffling. They don't really know what to say. And I'm starting to get to that point too.
Yeah, you mentioned the UK phase gave you kind of strengthened your scientific background. And just before this interview, I was watching a long presentation you gave in Spanish about the impacts of climate change on the world's oceans and the blue economy. And it was a really great presentation. I never knew that the FAO measured so many different metrics, like the oxygen levels in the upper level of the ocean and many different metrics. The presentation was done in 2022, and probably the data might have been up until 2018, 2019. Obviously, we've seen these remarkable increases in ocean temperatures in the last couple of years. And I just wondered if at all your outlook has changed based on what has been going on just recently.
Well, thank you for asking me that, because in fact, climate change and the marine environment was actually my main academic area of interest. And I published many papers on the subject and contributed to the International Panel of Climate Change. Many of the reports that you perhaps see behind me are actually those very detailed technical pieces of work on climate change and fisheries. And you mentioned one that we produced some time back, and you referred to that publication or that presentation that I gave. We actually provided an update on that publication this year, just about a month ago, in July, where we've spent the last 2 years linking together about 30 teams around the world that work on the modeling of the marine ecosystem and the impacts of climate change as a result of or through that modeling approach. And through those 2 years, we've actually started making sure that they use the same forcing functions, the same variables, they have the same considerations, and then we compare the results of all their models so that we can have one single message to come out of those. And that single message, in fact, is very consistent to what we were saying already 2 or 3 years ago. What we have now is a much more detailed understanding. So, for example, we know that by the middle of the century, we expect that the biomass, the animal biomass in the ocean, will actually decrease by about 5%. Particularly if we are under a low emission scenario, okay? Because we have to always take into consideration that the future, we don't know what the future is going to be like. If we have a low emission scenario, it's about a 5% decrease. If it is a high emission scenario, it's about 7%. But towards the end of the century, a low emission scenario only leads to about a 7% decrease in biomass, which is, by the way, perfectly manageable through management processes. But if we have a high emission scenario, that decrease goes up to about 20%. So we are much more accurate in estimating what the impacts are. And the reason why we're doing this is very important. The reason why FAO is doing this is not because we want to tell people necessarily exactly what's going to happen. It's to be able to develop adaptation strategies, to be able to say to countries, well, look, this is what we foresee. Of course, we cannot predict the future. We can only project a number of scenarios. But on the basis of this is what we propose that you do to adapt. And that has been very successful. We have adaptation projects around the world on this. And we will continue because the countries are asking us this information. We are a neutral body. We don't benefit at all from giving particular advice, while sometimes, academic institutions, they also look at their income, as of course they do. We don't have more income because we provide particular advice. So that neutrality is what gives us an opportunity to engage with countries in a very fair way and receiving very clear and positive response from them.
Right. And I think one of the things that you talked about was the way that fish populations move around with all of these changes. And we've seen these very quite contentious issues arise in I look a lot at pelagic fisheries because I look quite a lot at carnivorous aquaculture species. And what we've seen there in the last couple of years is you don't have this steady decline because of climate change, but you have more dramatic cycles of El Nino y La Nina affecting the Peruvian fishery. And then you have different pressures like the oil going more to nutraceuticals. And so what it seems to do, at least as the way I see it, is it creates more demand for other fisheries, and the maybe areas where there is cheap protein that goes into West Africa, and it kind of disrupts that cycle. Just curious how you see that.
Well, the climate change fundamentally does three things to the ocean. First, it warms the ocean. And through that warming, it changes the productivity of different species. To be very blunt, a species that likes cold water, you warm it, they're not going to do so well. But a species that maybe it's at the edge, in terms of at the edge of the cold edge of the distribution, you warm that water, they might be doing better. So first is a change in the productivity of the species, which is diverse. It's not the same for all species. The second is a change in distribution, because species, those that can, tend to follow the environmental preferences. And what that happens is when that happens, then you end up in the situation where countries have different species arriving to their waters. And some of the traditional fisheries are moving north or moving south, and new ones are coming to them, and they might not have management system for the new ones, and so and they might need to start working with their neighbors in terms of managing now a resource that has become transboundary because of movements. And the third change due to climate change is seasonality, things happening sooner than before. And that has impacts for the fishing industry in particular, the fishers that might actually not be prepared for particular activity when they were normally prepared for, and they have to adjust and adapt. I normally say that climate change is the ultimate disruptor is a disruptor of everything. And if you're not prepared to adapt to that disruptor, then you're going to be disrupted. And we have to make sure that countries understand that. But you mentioned something very specific, El Nino, and sort of these on-off processes that have happened in the ocean forever. El Nino has always been there, but that we can see the potential of climate change increasing either the intensity or the frequency of these events. And that's something that we need to take a lot of consideration for, because science is not very advanced in that sense. We don't really know whether that is the case, but if we suspect that El Nino will become more frequent or more intense as the climate warms, then we have to make sure again that we adapt and understand the implications of it. Otherwise, it's going to catch us unawares.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. One very experienced industry person that I spoke to the other day, and I won't say who they are, but said that in the future they thought that wild caught fish will become a delicacy. Do you see it that way?
I hope not. And it's not really my expectation, at least certainly not in my lifetime. But it very much depends on how seriously countries take sustainability. We have a situation where for the last 30 years, 35 years, global fisheries have been very stable. This is something that not everyone knows, but actually the peak production of global fisheries was in 1996, was 95 million tons. Our last record is 92 million tons currently. So it hasn't changed very much over the last 30 years or so, but it has come at the expense of sustainability. We have more resources that are unsustainably exploited. And by unsustainably exploited, I don't mean that they are collapsing. I mean, if I can use a banking analogy, is that we have a deposit in the bank and we are extracting more than the interest that the bank is giving us, right? And if you continue extracting more than the interest, then eventually your deposit, of course, becomes smaller and eventually your catches will decrease. So we are working very, very hard with all countries to make them understand how crucial it is to keep fisheries sustainable. I don't see aquaculture as replacing capture fisheries. I see aquaculture as adding a dimension that we didn't have before. Because, in the 1960s, we were consuming about 9 kilograms per person per year of fish. Now we are consuming over 20 kilograms per person per year. And the reason for that is fundamentally because of aquaculture. And if we didn't have aquaculture, that protein would have to come from somewhere else, therefore more pressure on land production systems or animal production systems. So aquaculture allows us to really protect the rest of the world, the rest of land and ecosystems from excessive use. And if we were to lose capture fisheries, if capture fisheries becomes really a luxury item, then we need other sources of food for the rest of the population. And where would those come from? So it is all about trade-offs. And I cannot see a good outcome if we do not protect capture fisheries as well.
No, absolutely. And just, I won't ask you many more questions because we've done quite a few, and I'm really grateful for your time. Do you think that we can still, here's probably my last hard question, but do you think that carnivorous species in aquaculture, do you think they can continue to afford to use pelagic fish, or do you think that those industries have to transition away from pelagic resources?
You mean that the aquaculture must transition to produce pelagic resources?
I mean, species that like salmon and shrimp, which are very popular in developed countries that have fish meal and fish oil content. Do you see the need for those industries to transition away from using wild caught fish in their feed?
Well, I think that many of these industries that carnivorous aquaculture that in the past used to only use fish meal to feed the fish are now transitioning to other feeds. We see it in salmon, we see it in shrimps. I mean, shrimps now, roughly, you only feed about 9% of the feed is actually fish meal. The other 91% is actually vegetable meals. I can't remember now the figures for cod, but it's a very significant transition. I think that what we will see is a much more technologically efficient way of using feeds, more supplements, specific diets for specific parts of the time of the life cycle. And that is absolutely correct. It's a new industry. It needs to develop and find more efficient and more technologically advanced methods. Growth in all sectors are not the result of having more infrastructure or more income or more money invested. It's actually about technological development through that industry, and aquaculture is no different. I think that carnivorous aquaculture has a role to play as well, because it provides good income as well for countries. I don't see any reason.
Yeah.
I don't think that do we need this is the right question, because do we need 90% of the things that we have around us? Well, maybe not. But they provide a number of avenues for growth, avenues for livelihoods, for opportunities. And I don't see any reason to say no to that, provided that it can be sustainably supported.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, when we talk about aquaculture, and I get often asked about aquaculture, and I always give examples that maybe not everybody knows about when they say, oh, this is a bad industry, right? And I say, well, look, you've got countries that 20 years ago were looking at the UN were advising that there was going to be a malnutrition problem. And I'm talking about countries like Bangladesh and Egypt that suddenly grew these massive aquaculture industries and completely averted the problem. And I like to use those examples. So it's really amazing the work that you do and the passion that you feel for it as well. And really appreciate your time and speaking to me.
Thank you. I also appreciate the time that you've invested in me, and I wish you well. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Manuel. Thank you for joining me.
All right.
And best of luck with the future goals of the FAO with fisheries.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.